Okay. So hello everybody, and welcome to this talk on the prehistoric archaeology of chat moss. Today I'm going to be talking about how the mossland formed and the lives of the prehistoric people who lived on its edges. We're going to begin with the Ice Age. After the glaciers melted, chat moss began to form and the earliest people returned to the land we now know as Britain. It's important to note that at this time Britain was not an island. The English Channel did not exist and Doggerland connected it to mainland Europe, and that's how people arrived from further south. So at this point in time, chat moss began to form in basins that were created by dead ice from melting glaciers. And here you can see the two basins in which it began forming, very close to present-day Ashley Moss on the north of chat moss. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Mesolithic occupation. The Mesolithic period lasted from 9000 to 4200 BC. The earliest sites are Nook Farm and the Moss Side in the north of chat moss, close to Ashley Moss. You can see that's very close to those very first basins. So at this point in time at Nook Farm, large-scale quarrying revealed a sandy knoll on which flint, brown chert and burnt stone were found over a 150 metre by 100 metre area. On a low sandy patch of skirtland, 240 metres by 60 metres near Moss Side, burnt stone and 2 pieces of flint were found. These were flint napping sites and may have been temporary camps. It seems likely that some of these flints were created in order to make weapons for hunting. So these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived a mobile and seasonal lifestyle, following herds of wild deer and aurochs from the uplands in summer to the lowlands in winter. For them, rivers and lakes were a source of wildfowl and fish. They foraged for fruits, berries and hazelnuts, and they made their shelters from birch or hazel poles and clothing from animal skins, furs and sinews. So at the beginning of the Mesolithic period, most of the woodland was pine and birch. And as things grew warmer, we got some of our deciduous trees, which were mainly hazel and oak. In this picture, you can see people using those stone implements. They're using them to cut down trees. They're using them as scrapers to scrape hides. They're also using them to make tools. These Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in close relationship with the land, the trees, the plants, and the fish and the animals they hunted. They believed in another world, a spirit world which was adjacent to our world, to which the spirits of both the human dead and the animals went. And they made offerings to these spirits, such as this antlered headdress, which was perhaps used in a hunting ritual from Starkart in Yorkshire. And what we find here with this offering back to the spirits of the deer is a reciprocal relationship with the land, which is very different to the worldview which we've got today in modern society. Now we pay the people for their labour for producing the food, but we don't give back to the land. A lot of our money feeds into the capitalist system instead. So moving on back to the formation of chat moss, peat accumulation began in the Neolithic period with cotton grass dominated vegetation. And Sphagnum cuspidatum began to form in pools in wetter periods. A prehistoric oak forest was on Little Woolden moss from 3545 to 3178 BC, so the mossland was only just beginning to form, and oak forests like this were quite common. And here you can see one of the magnificent bog oaks on Little Woolden moss. Because the land was so wet, people instead had to travel the rivers in dugout canoes. And you can see here this quite magnificent dugout oak canoe from one of those big bog oaks, which was found in the River Ribble and could be viewed in the Harris Museum. So we're going to move on now to talk about Neolithic and Bronze Age occupation. As chat moss developed as a shallow basin complex, occupation continued at Nook Farm, where there is evidence of the burning of birch to provide clearance for small-scale agriculture. The removal of trees that drained the land might have encouraged the spread of the bog. On a sandy ridge beside the Glazebrook at Great Woolden Hall, a selection of lithics was found, waste flakes, scrapers and cores, And this area, Great Woolden Hall, is very close to Little Woolden Moss. The evidence suggests that a temporary camp or a larger site might have been eroded by the Glazebrook, and here we are standing on the promontory, and we're looking down towards the Glazebrook, which you can see just behind that pony in the distance. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about the Neolithic Revolution and to set the lives of these people who were living in the Chat Moss area in context. So the Neolithic period lasted from 4200 to 2500 BC. Between 4200 and 3800 BC, people from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean brought what is known as the Neolithic package. This involved the cultivation of crops such as barley and emmer wheat, and the husbanding of animals such as cattle, pigs, and sheep. At this time, pottery was introduced, such as carinated bowls and impressed ware. And people created the first stone circles, such as Castlerig in Cumbria. And many of these stone circles were aligned in and orientated towards the winter solstice and the summer solstice, towards the sunrise and the sunset, towards the equinoxes, or towards the moon phases. And this showed that our ancestors, rather than being primitive, had a highly sophisticated view of the heavens, a good knowledge of the turning of the seasons, the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the stars. They also built passage graves, where multiple burials were made with grave goods. In fact, people were buried with grave goods, such as their weapons, with food and vessels for eating or drinking. Again, shows this belief in an other world. They believed that the soul went to a world which was very much like ours, and life continued in a similar way. Now, there's some quite famous passage graves, and these include Brinkethley D on Anglesey and Newgrange in Ireland. At Newgrange, this was orientated so that through a small hole in the wall, light shone in on the winter solstice, and people would go inside and they commune with their ancestors there. So these were obviously powerful places where the living and the dead met. One wonders whether pike stones up at Anglesey, which you can see here, it has been damaged quite badly, was once one of these magnificent chambers. At this point in time, people continued to deposit their offerings in wet places such as rivers and bogs. Again, we wonder whether that image of something precious sinking into a wet place mirrored the process of it passing to the other world. These offerings included stone hammers on Winmarleigh and Pilling Moss in North Lancashire. And from this local area, very close to Little Woolden Moss, near to the confluence of the Glazebrook and the River Mersey, we find a perforated hammerstone. So this might have been deposited by those very people who lived in the temporary camp at Great Woolden Hall on the edge of Little Woolden Moss. But further north from the Ribble, we find this perforated hammerstone, which we can see is from the Harris Museum, the other find being from Warrington Museum. And we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age began in 2500 BC and ended in 800 BC. And it began with an influx of Beaker people from the Tagus Valley in Iberia, who in 2000 BC brought metallurgy. And they were known as the Beaker people because they were buried with very distinctive bell beakers. Again, we find these depositions in wet places such as the Winmarleigh Hoard, which you can see as an immensely magnificent collection. And I had the pleasure of photographing that in the Warrington Museum just a few days ago. So this was deposited on Winmarleigh Moss in an oak box. And what's brilliant about this hoard is, unlike a lot of our precious objects from the north, it's actually stayed here rather than being taken away to the British Museum in London. Other bronze artefacts included jewellery and plates and vessels for eating and drinking. And the Bewcastle Cauldron pictured here was deposited in Black Moss in Cumbria. Some of these ancient cauldrons are really quite huge. You could fit not only a whole pig in them, but perhaps an ox. You could also fit in them copious quantities of mead or beer, and you can just imagine the types of feasts that went on around these cauldrons. I'm going to move on now to say a little bit about the language which the people spoke. So the Celtic language, they spoke a Celtic language, and it developed as a lingua franca in the Tagus Valley in Iberia between 4,500 and 3,000 BC, and then along the Atlantic seaways. You can see here that the Celtic languages are split into continental, then insular and Goidelic. And what we need to look at is the two branches on the left. Goidelic was a language spoken in Irish Manx and Scottish Gaelic, and the Brythonic language was spoken across most of Britain, and it went on to form the modern languages we know today as Breton, Cornish and Welsh. And what's really interesting about this was spoken in these areas from 2000 BC, and in the north we had a language called Cumbric, which was very similar to present-day Welsh, and that is remembered in the old sheep counting rhymes, which you may have heard of, such as Yantam Tevra. And this was spoken up to around 600 to 700 BC, which is when the Anglo-Saxons moved in and invaded, settled these lands. At that point in time, the Anglo-Saxon language began to replace the Brythonic language. So we're going to move back in time again, back to the Bronze Age. And at this point, society became more hierarchical, and single burials of rulers with exquisite grave goods were made in round barrows. Pictured here is a local round barrow. It's around Loaf up on Anglesarchy. If you've ever been there, you'll find it's quite a haunting and mysterious place. It can be quite difficult to find. It tends to kind of shift around if you go looking for it. And it's uncertain whether burials actually took place in Round Loaf at Anglesarchy, because unlike most of our barrows, it's never actually been excavated. So I'm going to move on from this tradition of burying the dead in burial mounds to the tradition of bog heads. I'm not going to show any photographs of bog heads tonight because due to the ethics about displaying the remains of the ancient dead and some of the debates around that. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So one of the bog heads we have from the local area is the cranium of Ashton Man from Ashton Moss. We also have a female head with red hair from Red Moss. Another one is a female head with long plaited auburn hair and 2 strings of jet beads and an amber bead wrapped in yellow woolen cloth from Pilling Moss. What's really quite interesting about this particular bog head is that it's been prepared either before this lady's life ended or after her death. She's had her hair plaited, she's been done up in her jewellery, and finally her head's been wrapped up in woolen cloth. This shows that her head has been buried with quite a lot of love and care. It may suggest she's a woman of stature. She may have been a holy woman. Contrastingly, we have a man's head from Briarfield with the mandible removed and marks from defleshing. We can see this head has suffered quite a lot of abuse. It seems that this might have been the head of an enemy. So we've got these two very contrasting treatments of these bog heads. And the way these heads are treated and buried may be rooted in the Celtic belief that the head was the seat of the soul. And this is typified in one of our oldest ancient British stories, in the story of Bran the Blessed. And he was a giant king of Britain, and he was killed, he was mortally wounded in battle in Ireland. There he asked his men to cut his head off and to bring it back to Britain. And over here his head continued to speak for a good number of years, before it was finally buried beneath White Hill in London, and it served a protective function. So perhaps these beliefs that the head could live on and speak after death are responsible for this tradition of the burial of bog heads, and it's serving a protective function. And this is actually backed up by the science. Depositing a head or anything else in a bog, such as butter, for example, slows its decay. This is due to the waterlogged anaerobic conditions of a bog and due to the work of sphagnum acids. On a darker note, it seems possible that people's heads might have been buried in bogs to prevent the soul from returning to the other world. And this tradition of the deposition of stone heads continued. So, for example, we've got this one from Ribbleton, It looks like rather than actually putting an actual human head in, sometimes these were substituted instead. So I'm going to move on to, we're going to return back to chat moss and to say a little bit more about its growth now. In the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, there was a shift to wetter conditions. This led the individual mires to outgrow their basins. Thus chat moss formed as a treacherous and impassable landscape of bog pools and sphagnum hummocks. The dominant species of sphagnum was Sphagnum imbricatum. This important peat-forming species has been lost from most of the Manchester mosslands, unfortunately, yet we do have a number of Manchester mosslands which can be found, such as the aquatic one which you find in many bog pools, Sphagnum cuspidatum, a nice big chunky peat-forming sphagnums such as palustra and papillossum, and other sphagnums such as subnitans and fimbriatum. So chat moss continued to grow and develop. It grew to 35 miles in expanse and remained relatively untouched for hundreds of years. On this John Speed map from 1610, we can see the extent of the moss. So chat moss is there in the middle, and Martin Mere, which was once England's largest lake, is there in the top left-hand corner. And both of these two great landmarks in the Lancashire area are very, very sadly being drained off, but both of them are currently in the process of being restored. Now, part of the reason for the draining of chat moss may be that it was inhospitable, it was impassable. Daniel Defoe visited it in 1724, and he really did not like the place. He said, "From hence, on the road to Manchester, we passed a great bog or waste called Chat Moss. The surface at a distance looks black and dirty, and is indeed frightful to think of, for it will bear neither horse or man, unless in an extremely dry season. What nature meant by such a useless production is hard to imagine, but the land is entirely waste, except for the poor cottagers' fuel, and the quantity used for that is very small." So we're going to move on now to talk a little bit about the Iron Age. So with this, with the weather growing colder and wetter, with this deterioration of the climate, we also had kind of like a decline in culture as well. So the Iron Age took place between 800 BC and 43 AD. It began with the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean and Near East around 1200 BC. The disruption of trade routes caused shortages of copper and tin to make bronze, so people turned to iron instead. The shifting climate caused a retreat from wet places to hill forts on hills, such as Mantor, which many of you are probably familiar with. So as the weather grew harsher, this seems to be one of the causes of the division of people into tribes. Now, these tribal names are recorded from the Romans. And it's important to say at this point in time that the people of Britain didn't actually write anything down. So much of what we have recorded is from the viewpoint of the Romans, who obviously were the victors over them. They were the conquerors, they were the enemies. And often what the Romans say has to be taken with a pinch of salt. But I think with things that are a little bit more objective, like tribal names and tribal boundaries, we can be a little bit safer. So the tribes of northern Britain included the Brigantes, the high ones, who occupied Yorkshire and the Pennines, Corvetii, the stag people from Cumbria, the Cornovii, the people of the Horn from Cheshire, and the Setantii, the reaping people from Lancashire. Now, the Setantii, these are recorded, so that this is our local tribe in Lancashire, particularly from the lowland areas. So their territory was from the Mersey up to the mouth of the Wyre. And we know this from the Roman geographer Ptolemy. In his Geography 2 AD, he cites the harbour, the port of the Setantii, Portus Setantiorum, at the mouth of the Wyre. He also notes that the Mersey he calls Setea Est, and Setea may well have been the name of its goddess. So we've got this Celtic root here, Set, which the scholar Andrew Breeze claims is corrupted from Met, And he says that's very similar to the modern day Welsh, medi, which means to reap. And he suggests the Satantii were the reaping people. He says they were not just harmless agriculturists. He suggests instead that they were reapers of men, which fits with them perhaps being reapers of heads in this burial of bog heads. The Romans also record that at this point in time, this tribal society had a very hierarchical social structure. There were chieftains, there were warriors, there were druids whose roles were both as priests and as politicians. There were ovates or seers who divined the future. There were also bards. They were storytellers or law keepers. And because they didn't write anything down, they had remarkable memories, remembering the stories and poems of the land. And some of these, even from this time, perhaps live on in medieval Welsh literature today, through that Brythonic tradition which has been passed down and has stayed alive in Wales. Religion at this point in time was polytheistic. Polytheism means belief in many gods, and we had numerous local deities, including Satea, goddess of the Mersey, Bellissima, goddess of the Ribble, Brigantia, the High One, goddess of the Pennines, and Nodens, the catcher or the hunter. Now, what's interesting about Nodens is that there were 2 silver statuettes dedicated to him, which were found on Cockerham Moss, close to Winmarleigh Moss in North Lancashire. And with them being found on a mossland, we wonder whether he had a connection with mosslands, a connection with bogs. We also have Meponos, the son, and his mother Matrona, and they've got altars at Ribchester. And Matrona may be depicted perhaps in triple form or with 2 other mothers as the Matronii on this baptismal font, on this altar, which is currently used as a baptismal font at St John's Church in Lund. So I think it's really quite lovely here how we have this very old pagan tradition of these mothers on a baptismal font. What's interesting is that Faith, Hope and Charity stand in the stained glass window above, suggesting that kind of continuity of these 3 deities looking after newly baptised children. So we're going to move back to our local sites now. We're going to move back to Chat Moss. We're going to tell you a little bit about the Great Woolden Hall Roundhouse site. So in the Iron Age, a promontory enclosure with double ditches and 4 roundhouses was built on the sandy ridge at Great Woolden. So we see this continuity dating back to the Neolithic and Bronze Age to what may have been either a temporary or a permanent camp. This was obviously an important place for these people which was later enclosed during the Iron Age. It was occupied from 120 BC into the Romano-British period until 320 AD. Fragments of a saddle quern and lower stone of a rotary quern suggest the inhabitants grew and ground their own wheat or barley. Pottery included a hand-made bowl, a red-brown cooking pot, and 1 kilogram of Cheshire very coarse pottery sherds. These were all of native make, and they also included Roman coarse pottery, which suggests these people traded with the Romans. There were hearths on site, which were used for cooking and for making tools. This all suggests that they led a self-sufficient lifestyle changed little by Roman rule, and that they were on trading terms with the Romans. I'm going to set the lives of these people again within the historic context now, and say a little bit about the Roman invasions. These began with Julius Caesar in 55 and 54 BC, and were largely unsuccessful. They recommenced with Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. At this point in time, most of the north was ruled by Queen Cartimandua and the Brigantes Federation, so the Satantii might have been a subset of the Brigantes at this point in time, and she allied with the Romans rather than battling against them. This is illustrated by the fact that in 51 AD, when the British rebel Caraticus fled to Cartimandua, she handed him back in chains to the Romans. So that's depicted in this drawing here. And this allegiance between Cartimandua and the Romans ended around 70 AD when her husband Venutius rebelled against her and won. This may not have been as much a political rebellion as a personal one. It's rumoured that Cartimandua slept with her shield bearer, so he's obviously very offended by that. So he rebelled against her, seized control of the Brigantes, and she was forced to flee with the Romans overseas. Afterwards, the conquest of northern Britain took place in the AD 70s under Cerealis. This led to the establishment of Roman forts at Diva, Chester, Mamucium, Manchester, Remetenacum, Ribchester, Lancaster, and Eboracum, York. The Romans pushed north to build Hadrian's Wall in 122 AD and the Antonine Wall in 138 AD, but the latter was soon abandoned. I'm going to move on to talk about some Romano-British bog burials now that took place at this point in time. The most famous are from Lindow Moss in Cheshire. These include the head of Lindow woman with her left eyeball and hair, the body of Lindow man, whose injuries demonstrate he died a violent death. He was hit on the head twice with an axe, garroted, and his throat slashed. Then he was pushed face down into the bog. This overkill is highly suggestive of a ritual execution. His body has been dated to 2 BC to 129 AD, so this very turbulent time that the Romans were invading northern Britain. This has been hypothesized. He was sacrificed to the gods in exchange for power to fight against the Romans. So I'm going to say a little bit about human sacrifice and a little bit about whether or not it took place. According to the Romans, it certainly did. And we need to take into account here that they were writing from about their enemies and they were setting out to demonize them. But at the same point in time, there's often not smoke without fire. There may be some truth within what they say, and this does tend to be backed up by the archaeological evidence. So Julius Caesar says of the Gauls, who had very similar traditions to the Britons, it said that the Gaulish traditions actually came from Britain. Julius Caesar says, "The nation of all the Gauls is extremely devoted to superstitious rites. They either sacrifice men as victims or vow that they will sacrifice them and employ the Druids as the performers of these sacrifices." Diodorus Siculus says, "They choose a person for death and stab him or her in the chest. By the convulsions of the victim's limbs and spurting of blood, they tell the future. They would strike a man who had been consecrated for sacrifice in the back with a sword and make prophecies based on his death spasms," says Strabo. And there are records of sacrifices to some of the Gaulish deities, including to Esus by hanging, Tritatis by drowning in a vat, and to Tyrannus by burning in a wicker man. And those of you who've seen the Wicker Man film will be familiar with this image. This picture is from the image is from the Gundestrup Cauldron, which was found in the Gundestrup Bog in Denmark. And although it's found in Denmark, it has been suggested that it actually contains Celtic imagery. People have suggested this deity may be Tritatis, for example, with somebody drowning in a vat, and that these little warriors at the bottom are people who are undergoing some kind of sacrificial kind of ritual in which they're immersed into that vat and then they emerge reborn. So you wonder whether this notion of sacrifice, that somebody who dies by drowning comes out of one of these quite kind of magnificent kind of spirit guardians who you can see are on their horses, and they've got these little totems on their heads, such as the boar little birds. So that's one possible reading of the image on this cauldron. So I'm going to tell you now about Worsley Man, who is a local bog burial. His skull was found in 1958 by a peat cutter in Trench 8, Flat 6, in the north of Astley Moss, so very, very local to us. Attached to his skull was his deformed right ear, which might have been a congenital deformity or resulted from fighting, i.e. a cauliflower ear. This means he might have been a warrior. The damage to his skull shows he died a particularly violent death. He was struck a bloody blow to the side of his head, followed by a fatal blow to the top of his head, then decapitated in 2 strokes. His head was purposely placed in the bog. His skull has been dated to 131 to 251 AD. He was 26 to 45 years old when he was killed. He had light brown hair with hints of grey, defined brows, a square jaw, and a broad, flat nose. So why, you might wonder, Was Worsley Man selected for this fate? Was he an enemy or a criminal? Was he victimised because he was seen as other? Perhaps because of his cauliflower ear? Perhaps because he had some kind of physical deformity. We haven't seen his body, only his head. Perhaps he had a mental disability. Was his head placed in the bog as a punishment, or to prevent his spirit from returning to take vengeance? Or was he a revered person, selected for this death so his spirit could live on to commune with his people, perhaps as some kind of spirit guardian? Was he sacrificed as a gift to the deities of the bog, or in hope of an exchange of power? We also don't know where he was from, whether he was a local man, or whether he's from further afield. So these questions and the story of Worsley Man remain as mysterious as chat moss and its mists. I'd like to finish with some acknowledgements. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Hannah White at Warrington Museum and Archives for allowing me to visit and photograph the perforated hammerstone and Winmarley Hoard and permission to use the photographs. I'd like to thank Philip Jeffs at Warrington Museum and Archives for giving me access to valuable documents and for allowing me to visit the Great Woolden Hall Farm Iron Age Roundhouse site, which lies on his family's land, and for permission to use the photographs. I'd also like to thank the Harris Museum Preston and Tully House Museum Carlisle for use of the photographs. And all the photographs you've seen today are by me or from Wikipedia Commons. So we've got a bibliography here, which I can return to if anyone's interested. I'd like to go back to this slide now, and I'd like to finish by asking whether anybody's got any questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lorna. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you want to stop screen sharing now, so we're not just in teeny tiny boxes, but yeah, I'm sure everyone else who's watching will have just found that as interesting as I did. Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions, please just pop them into the Q&A. There's a couple that have come through already, so I'm just going to dive right in. So one saying, do you think Worsley Man might have lived at the Iron Age Roundhouse site that's at Great Woolden Hall? They're very close to where he was found. Is that a possibility?
I think it's certainly a possibility, yes. And it would be quite exciting to think that he had lived all that time in this land and be connected to it. And of course, what would be the great mystery was, well, you know, if he was a local person, he lived and belonged on this land, then why was he taken out there and why was he sacrificed? You know, was he, I don't know, did he fall out with somebody or, you know, did he offer himself as a sacrifice? Or you just don't know. There's so many different reasons that it could have happened.
It is a really intriguing mystery, and it would be amazing to be able to go back. I suppose all we can do is take the sort of definite evidence that we have, and then, you know, make our own decisions, make our own judgments about that. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's really fascinating. Yeah, so move on. Some other questions come in. Do you think if people had continued to see bogs as these wonderful kind of sacred places, do you think that might have prevented them from suffering the fate which so many of our peatlands have done, and of being drained and extracted and really the life being taken out of them?
I think so, really. I think if you see a place as sacred and inspirited and you've got that connection, that relationship, I mean, people, rather than extracting, they were putting things that are really important to them back into the bog, you know. It was completely different. So I think, yeah, rather than see it as something for our taking, and perhaps almost as having that sense of reverence and awe as well, you know, seeing it as a bit of a scary place. I think if we had that, I think if we kept that, then it would definitely be very different.
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem like there was a real shift in how people viewed our peat bogs, from this amazing sacred place to actually something that, you know, that Daniel Defoe quote of "the land is entirely waste." There's been which is one of my favourites, but you know, there's obviously been a real paradigm shift there, and you just wonder what kind of caused that to happen. So we've got another couple of questions that have come in. Is there any theories about what happened to the bodies of the decapitated people? If we're only finding the heads, what happened to the rest of them?
That is such a good question. I mean, because obviously with the peat bogs, I mean, some of the bodies are preserved, aren't they? So we have Lindo Man, so his, you know, he really stands out because his skin was preserved, but his bones weren't. Whereas in a lot of the other cases, we're finding skulls, we're finding hair, and you know, even you know, people's eyeballs and ears and things like that. But yeah, what happened to the rest of them? What did they do with their bodies? Why did they separate their heads? And you know, were their bodies interred somewhere different? And to be honest, I've not really heard that question or seen it written about in scholarly articles. So
maybe this is something we need to look into further.
yeah, where did the bodies of these heads go?
Yeah, it is a really, it's something I've not thought about, and it is fascinating. I think this is definitely, there's a PhD in there somewhere, isn't there? So we've got another question as well, that we've got really specific dates, the bog oaks. How can we be so sure of those? How do we know how old these preserved kind of trees are?
I think it's by radiocarbon dating. I'm not an archaeologist, so to be honest, I can't really say much more about the technicalities of it. But yeah, maybe have a look at radiocarbon dating, and that might give you some leads to the answer to that question. But I personally can't tell you.
Yeah, I think as far as I'm aware, they have been radiocarbon dated. There is one of the bog oaks on Little Woolden Moss that has kind of a little slice almost taken out of it, and that I believe was taken so that a sample could be sent off for radiocarbon dating. And then yeah, that's how we know how old the bog oaks are. Yeah, which is amazing, you know, to look at them now. It kind of looks like, oh, well, there's a tree that fell down a little while ago and it's gone a bit black because it's been, you know, in with the peat, but oh, it's thousands of years old. And yeah, I just find that completely mind-boggling. Sit there and you touch it, and I just think it's fantastic. Right, let's just see. And I think I've just got oh, it's another question that's come up. When we were talking about these stone circles and some of the passage graves and saying that they're aligned towards sort of winter and summer equinoxes, how do we know that? Because have not the kind of the Earth's moved in a way that actually the sun isn't at the same place anymore as it used to be thousands of years ago. So can we kind of track that back? How do we know that they were aligned, or is it still aligned in the same way?
I think that's probably how they've done it, as far as I know. But then you do, I mean, if they're continuing, you know, at Stonehenge with similar stones, then yeah, I'm not actually sure, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I know there has been work kind of tracing them back, but I'm not sure how much they've shifted since then. So again, I think that's another one to kind of go away and research.
Yeah, find out a bit
more. Obviously,
more.
these places are still functioning and people are still celebrating these places and using these stones. I mean, we've got the new stone circle up at Brockholes, haven't we? Yeah. Which is obviously being put in at this time of year. And, you know, the winter solstice stone is functioning as a winter solstice stone at the perfect place because we put it in now. So, yeah, it would be interesting to see how some of the others work. So I know Stonehenge is obviously, for example, functioning in the same way. So.
Fascinating. Just coming back to the question about what happened to the bodies of these headless, bodiless heads, amputated heads. Somebody's suggesting that maybe the bodies were actually left to carrion, or they could have been burnt on a pyre, which I think is, yeah, it's a definite possibility, isn't it? And I know there are examples of kind of bodies being left, as you say, to carrion, and so that, you know, animals could come and kind of eat them in other places and in different cultures. So I think that's a really likely possibility as much as any of them are. And yeah, there's just one other question that's come in. Just going back to the languages, how do we know so much about all the different languages that were spoken? You know, how, because there was that really fascinating slide that showed the evolution of the language, and it took us out to, you know, the Yantan tetherer that actually we had a comment in the chat saying that up at Sellafield, I think, yeah, some people working at the high-tech Sellafield nuclear site still say Yantan, etc. So, up in deep West Cumbria, people are still doing it, and I know, you know, it was always it was a way of counting sheep as well. But yeah, how do we know so much about the about those languages? Do we have written records, or?
I guess it's the work of linguists, and again, they must have traced, I suppose, the patterns of language back, you know, so for example, to the Tagus Valley in Iberia, and picked up on, you know, all the different developments as they've slowly been made. I mean, I can show you the book, which I got a lot of that from. It's up on my bookshelf.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so if you can see this, Britain Begins by Barry Cunliffe. He writes quite a lot about that in there.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. So, that'd be a really interesting.
Yeah, that's one to have a good look in. It's a really good book.
Excellent. Britain Begins. Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Now I've just got one last comment that's come in, just going back to the question about the alignment of our stone circles and burial graves. That maybe the shifting of the earth actually is much longer ago than the circle alignments, and they're comparatively recent, so in fact there may not be much of a difference between kind of then and now, even though it is over thousands of years. I suppose in the grand history of time, that's only a tiny speck, isn't it? Fantastic. Well, oh, let me just check if any other questions have come through. Oh, we've got a few more here. Brilliant. So do you think we will find anything else in the bogs on our mosses, we call them here, or are they so depleted that basically everything, you know, that would be found has all gone?
I think there's potentially places that haven't been cut over. I mean, only parts of Astley have been cut over as far as I know.
Yeah.
I know pretty much all of Little Woolden has been extracted, and anything that was on there would probably have just been crunched up and, you know, in the millers and things, which is very sad, really. It said on the news, didn't it? There was another body found on Red Moss quite recently, but potentially not a particularly old one.
No, unfortunately, if anyone didn't know, unfortunately there was a body found on Red Moss, which is in Bolton, but unfortunately that was a fairly recent thing. But apparently the person has been identified and the family have been informed. But it's very sad. But yeah, I mean, I suppose there is still possibility. There are still fragments, aren't there, of not necessarily untouched, but less touched bog out there, and certainly on Chat Moss. And obviously, you know, there are other places, even in the northwest. We recently went on a visit to Foulshaw Moss in Cumbria, and up there they've got, you know, 6 meters of peat in some places, whereas, you know, in Little Woolden Moss, where some bits we're lucky to have 60 centimeters. So yeah, you know, there could be things in there that we may never know about, because the only way we'd find it would be to dig it up and destroy it, which hopefully we'll stop doing. Actually, that brings us on to another question. Just the mosses are currently being restored after years of peat extraction, which is true of a lot of the sites that we look after at Lancashire Wildlife Trust. Does that restoration help or hinder archaeological study?
It's quite a difficult question. Well, I think quite a lot of the works from, I mean, you might know more about this than me, Jenny, but when kind of like the planning applications go through for restoration works. We start out with a lot of bunding work, don't we, which we bring the diggers in. And I think sometimes, doesn't that have to actually have some kind of archaeological survey and things?
Yeah, before we do any works, we have to do I think it's known as a historic environment record search, to check whether there is the likelihood of there being any sort of historic artifacts or archaeology in the area, and that has to be taken into account with any work that we're doing. Generally, with the kind of bunding works, it does involve digging down a bit, but we try to be as gentle as possible, kind of keeping that water on site and helping to restore it. But I think, there is always the potential to, one day there's a digger going in, digging a trench for a new bund, and we could find something. So you never know. Okay, couple more little questions. Is Chatmoss in any danger of development or change as vital carbon capture system? I can maybe take that one if you want. Yeah, so Chatmoss was once one of our biggest lowland raised peat bogs. Over 99% of that has now basically become very seriously damaged or degraded as a result of drainage and either peat extraction, and a lot of it's gone for horticulture, or a lot of the land has been converted to agricultural use. As a result of that, as soon as any of our peatlands are damaged or degraded in any way, all the carbon that's stored within the peat gets oxidized. Carbon and oxygen is carbon dioxide. That then gets released, and that's obviously a really potent greenhouse gas and is contributing to the climate emergency. So what we are campaigning for here at the Wildlife Trust is to try and look at different ways of managing the land to preserve that carbon and to keep it locked in the ground. And actually, once peatlands are really healthy again, they will sequester carbon from the atmosphere. They'll literally suck it out of the ground, suck it out the air, sorry, and bury it, the peat, beneath us. So what we're doing is we're either looking at land that we can restore, bring it back to sort of functioning bog, or maybe look at different ways of managing the land that are keeping it sort of ecologically and environmentally sort of sensitive and friendly, but whilst also it could still remain profitable for the landowners. So yeah, any kind of development on Chatmoss we really need to look at. I know there are current sort of developments in the plans for sort of housing and things like that, and that's definitely something we need to think about, and think about ways of mitigating effects on that, and try and really protect these incredibly important and just fascinating habitats. Fantastic. Right, I've got a couple of last couple of questions we might just be able to fit in. So one of my favourite bog bodies, which I say with the utmost respect, sorry, this is the words of the question, is the one which was either named, or I think was suggested that he was named Peat Marsh. Was that one of the bodies you mentioned, or a different one? Are you aware of Peat Marsh, Lorna?
Yeah, he was Lindo Man.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so I did speak about him today. That was kind of like one of his nicknames, yeah.
Right, as in Pete, as in P-E-T-E being the name Pete, and P-E-A-T being Pete. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's actually quite sweet. I suppose it would be quite nice to try and give him a name and sort of think about him a little more. Okay. Well, if anyone's got any other questions, please shout out now. But otherwise, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to Lorna for giving us such a really interesting talk. Yeah, it's just been great. Thank you, everyone. And as I say, the talk's being recorded, and we'll get that up on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So if you just go onto YouTube and search Lancashire Wildlife Trust, it'll be up there. But also don't forget to check out the Lancashire Peatlands Initiative on Facebook. And that's where basically all of everything peaty in Lancashire, Manchester and North Merseyside, all of our work, we'll put it all on there. And if you have any other questions as well, please, please just send us an email, message us on Facebook, give us a call. We really love to chat. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lorna, and take care. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.